Good morning. The Yoga of Relationships by Isabella Viglietti in a chapter of Sex and Duality. Mhm. Duality without self-inquiry create a complicated, neurotic, and ultimately unwinnable battle between religion and science, with religion trying to control it and science trying to unleash it. Sorry, it's a bit dark this morning. Let me just get a light. Okay. Okay, that should help. There we go. Let me see. Sex and duality. Duality without self-inquiry creates a complicated, neurotic, and ultimately unwinnable battle between religion and science, with religion trying to control it and science trying to unleash it. Religion's conclusion, based on a negative view of sex, amounts to repression and causes deep dissatisfaction. Science's seemingly positive freedom-oriented view is equally unworkable. Unfettered indulgence brings dependence, bondage, and acute suffering, not harmony and self-respect to our intimate relationships. As the Rolling Stones sang, I can get no satisfaction. What is the solution to this seemingly intractable problem? We have two options. Either control our sexual impulses or let them control us. Rigorous self-inquiry, examining this important feeling in light of self-knowledge, is the royal road to a satisfying sex life. Understanding the psycho-spiritual factors, particularly our value for non-injury, behind this merciless impulse is the only way to control our sexuality, not unrestrained gratification. We are not doomed to slavishly follow this dictatorial force, nor are we required to deny the need to pleasure ourselves if this attractive impulse conforms to common sense and the moral laws that govern life. Through self-inquiry, we can embrace our sexuality with dignity and claim the nobility that is our birthright. A definition of sex. Sex, next to security, takes up fac- a large fraction of our mental, emotional real estate. Before we investigate this problem, we need a clear definition of sex. To avoid argument, let's think about what happens when we have a successful sexual encounter. Some men and women claim they can produce orgasms with the mind alone, but even then they must contact certain thoughts and feelings to arouse themselves and bring one about, a blissful state of mind suspension, which, knowingly or not, is union with yourself. When it happens, we think the pleasure comes from the orgasm, but actually it comes from contact with ourself, which floods the mind when the pressure of desire is suspended for a short while. Many people experience orgasm while dreaming, aptly termed wet dreams. We may have no idea what this kind of orgasm feels like because we have never experienced it, But let's assume that it feels exactly like orgasms produced when two bodies successfully copulate or one body manages it solo. It doesn't matter. However, because one or two bodies will not go about this tricky business unless sexy thoughts drive them. Yes, it doesn't matter, however, because one or two bodies will not go about this tricky business unless sexy thoughts drive them. Licking honey of a blade. Sex is contact with an object, subtle or gross, that brings pleasure, resulting in orgasm, and sometimes without it. There's a lot of pleasure locked in the human body, and there are many ways to access it. Sexual orgasm is not the only way. Pleasure is a dangerous energy, and it comes at a price. We can neither avoid it nor overindulge without severe consequences. Chasing pleasure is like licking honey off a blade, as the Buddha so aptly put it. The sweet is there, but beware of the hidden pain. So is sex about sex? When a strong sexual desire takes over the mind, I want sex because I want to be free of the desire for sex. We know this because good sex removes the desire. If it didn't, I would be uninterested in sex because constant desire is painful. The reason we enjoy sleep so much is that we are not tormented by desire while we sleep. Sleep is like a diffused, undramatic orgasm because my mind is suspended for many hours. The French call a successful orgasm in the waking state la petite mort, a little death. Unlike Hamlet, who called it grand mort, physical death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, orgasm is a well-known country from which I always return, delivered once again to the world of endless, gnawing desire. Because my little sexual deaths happen in the waking state, full of tensions. They seem like big explosions of life. A popular type of sex portrayed in the movies happens in moments of fear-induced existential tension. The participants are usually too hurried to get rid of their lust properly, that is, take off their clothes, get horizontal, and do it with dignity, perhaps even with a bit of love. They rip off just enough to expose their genitals and fornicate wildly, plastered against a wall or on a kitchen counter amid a clutter of dishes. It's all quite thrilling, and God bless them. But there, La Petite Mort is pretty indeed. They haven't even time to lounge around or ask, was it good for you? No, their minds go right back to their previously anxious state, and they rush out the door to meet their rapidly fructifying karma elsewhere. So sex is the removal of desire to produce pleasure. While sex, however, removes desire and produces pleasure, pleasure experience pleasure pleasurable experiences create more desire. Thus we find ourselves in a zero-sum situation. To extricate ourselves, we need to ask, is pleasure really about pleasure? The origin of the craving. The ancient Greeks observed that animals have sex, and human beings have a need for touch, for contact, which they labeled eros, a deeper union with the soul than mere sexual penetration. In the last 100 years, psychologists, psychiatrists, sexologists, and some sex therapists have successfully rescued much of the public from some of the guilt and shame associated with puritanical views. But in doing so, the deeper meaning of eros has been lost. We've become jaded and blasé, bombarded by sex-based advertising and entertainment. Mountains of glossy supermarket and online magazines offer various tricks to get the spark back into our moribund sex lives. We have already pointed out that sex is not an end in itself. Beneath the craving for human contact lies a desire for wholeness, union with the self, or the soul, as some call it. Craving is a sign that we don't value ourselves, no matter how much we are indoctrinated by the prevailing idea that sex is the be-all and end-all of human experiences. The more the better, and that there is something wrong with me if my sex life does not measure up to society's distorted views. Few of us question the belief that I need to pleasure myself. But why do I want to pleasure myself? Because it feels good is an obvious but insufficient answer. The unseen truth is that I want to pleasure myself because I love myself when I am free of desire. When I am filled with desire, I do not love myself. If I loved myself and I was full of desire, I wouldn't need to remove the desire by pleasuring myself, because love of myself is my highest value and the greatest pleasure. We love the means for the sake of the end, but we love the end for its own sake. In the post-coital state, I'm supremely self-satisfied. I'm not satisfied because I pleasured myself. Sex only got me there. I am satisfied because I am in union with my capital S self, which is love. I would very much like to be self-satisfied all the time, but if I associate the satisfaction with sex, not the fact that I am non-separate from myself, I will reap as much dissatisfaction as satisfaction, making sex a zero-sum situation. So sex is actually about self-love, not about satisfying my desires with a momentary pleasure. The most difficult step, however, is accepting the fact that I don't need love, which implies that my idea of who I am is faulty, which in turn meets with serious resistance. I must entertain and face the possibility that I have been barking up the wrong emotional tree my whole life. As you may have realized by now, the right tree is the tree of self-knowledge, but we're not quite there yet. We need to examine our views on sex more carefully, where they come from, and why they do or don't work. Let's consider the four major factors that shape and influence our sexual values. 1. Contextual sexual values, biological and cultural narratives. Genetics. Since primitive forms of life appeared on this planet, sex has been about procreation and proliferation of the species. From an evolutionary perspective, it's a reward system our genes use to replicate themselves. Perhaps one fine day, science will edit our embryonic sex genes to produce the ideal sexual experience for everyone, but not in the immediate future. In the meantime, we are seemingly stuck with the biological imperative. Then, pre-agrarian, non-monogamous, guilt-free sex. Evidently, The biological imperative favored the harem model seen in apes. A dominant male controlled a bevy of gorgeous females who were at his beck and call day and night. After some time, a few million years ago, our knuckle-dragger ancestor stood on his hind legs and achieved a more exalted status, Homo erectus. Some researchers claim that these distant ancestors, as do some isolated cultures today, shared mates freely, without guilt or shame, much as they shared food and other resources. Natural, instinctive, casual sex was the norm and strengthened social bonds, thus ensuring the survival of the species. Anthropologists called this idea fierce egalitarianism and claimed it was the it was the de facto pattern of social organization for many millennia before the advent of agriculture. In other words, casual sex is the natural order of things, and deviating from it has supposedly created today's sexual mess. Ownership, security, and control. In hunter-gatherer societies, there were no fences, and people roamed freely in search of sustenance. About 10,000 years ago, agrarianism brought about a huge cultural shift that changed the balance of power between men and women. Now it became important to know where your field ended and your neighbors began, which led to the idea of private property, which was extended to include females who maintained the home. Paternity became a crucial issue, and with it, the need to control women, the receptacle of the man's seed. Why would a man work hard to bring home the bacon for someone else's progeny? Men owned women's wombs, forcing them to barter their sexuality and reproductive capacity to gain access to the resources and protection they needed to survive. Archaeologist Timothy Taylor, author of The Prehistory of Sex, was led by his survey of the archaeological evidence to state while hunter-gatherer sex had been modeled on an idea of sharing and complementarity, early agricultural sex was voyeuristic, repressive, homophobic, and focused on reproduction. Afraid of the wild, he concludes, farmers sex farmers set out to destroy it. Sorry, I'll read it again. While hunter-gatherer sex had been modeled on an idea of sharing and complementarity, early agriculturalist sex was voyeuristic, repressive, homophobic, and focused on reproduction. Afraid of the wild, he concludes, farmers set out to destroy it. Sexual freedom was sacrificed for security. The nuclear family. The barter system of the agricultural age solidified, refined, and ossified during the industrial age, culminating during Victorian times in the form of the monogamous traditional nuclear family unit, which required strict fidelity. which required strict fidelity. By and large, it seems, sexual intimacy was sacrificed on the altar of monogamy in exchange for family stability and companionship. While these are spiritual values, they come with an obvious downside: sexual hypocrisy in the form of infidelity and, of course, divorce. The scriptures imposed by the nuclear model came under attack towards the end of the 20th century with the advent of the sexual revolution in the West, when profligate free love was immortalized in the Beatles' lyric, "Why don't we do it in the road?" Exciting as the idea of free love viewed from the confines of the nuclear family prison is, it will be difficult to avoid the conclusion that it did not quickly evolve into the war of the sexes and the depressing sexual atmosphere that we have today. Sexual freedom was not that free, after all. The monogamous nuclear family idea held fast, although today it seems to be under siege. According to many studies, nearly 50% of women in the West suffer from sexual dysfunction, while Viagra breaks sales records year after year. Worldwide, pornography rakes in anywhere from 50 to $100 billion annually. In the United States, it generates more revenue than CBS, NBC, ABC, and all professional sports franchises combined. According to US News and World Report, Americans spend more money at strip clubs than on Broadway, off-Broadway, regional and non-profit theaters, the opera, the ballet, and jazz and classical music performances. These facts seem to suggest that the long-term nuclear family model conflicts with a powerful need for unfettered sexual gratification. At the same time, the possessive, monogamous nuclear family model is here to stay because it plays an important role in our survival today. It provides the security necessary to give human offspring the opportunity to stand on their own 2 feet, a 20-year survival requirement that doesn't apply to other species and goes to show that our need for security trumps our need for pleasure. 2. The universal psychological order, attitudes and ideas. For animals, sex is a natural activity related solely to the need to reproduce the species. Owing to non-reproductive related psychological issues, humans are capable of developing unhealthy sexual views. Treating sex as a natural activity is surely a good thing, but if we do not have self-aware confidence to exercise dispassionate choices and gain control of our sexuality, we can easily find ourselves in demeaning and unsatisfying sexual situations. Conditioning is not something you choose. It is not your fault if you do not possess the values required to make good choices. For instance, childhood sexual abuse compromises one's opportunity for a healthy adult sex life. The abuse of intimacy erodes all the building blocks of agency, like self-esteem, resiliency, and the confidence that will not be injured. But although we are not to blame for our biology, our past, or our psychology, as long as we don't understand it, we are when we do. If I refuse to implement the changes understanding implies, the suffering is on me. Blame and clinging to a wounded persona doesn't work. The buck stops with me. We inherit our sexual attitudes, ideas, and practices from society. Without looking too far back, the 19th century Victorian world had the print media and Freud to thank for opening an inquiry into human sexuality. Before the Industrial Revolution, public debate on sex and sexuality was probably very limited, if not non-existent. Freud stated the obvious by publicizing a basic duality, the pleasure-pain principle, placing undue emphasis on the libido when psychospiritual factors play a more important part than raw biology. Yes, sex is life's clever trick to keep the species going, but so what? Maybe ducks and monkeys have no options, but I always have the option to focus on the many other attractive aspects of life. As information technology advanced, so did the public's awareness of its sexual attitudes and mores. With the advent of the internet, we probably know too much to make a reasoned study of our sexuality. For most of the last century, it is probably fair to see the therapeutic world as a secular attempt to compete with religion in the business of cleaning up sinners. Its model of the ego, which sees childhood trauma and libidinal impulses as the cause of suffering, was taken as seriously as church doctrine by a significant segment of the thinking public for the better part of the century, and it persists to this day. Sex and religion are always intertwined in some way. Religion has failed miserably to suppress and demonize the sex urge. Some religions present the view that only procreational sex is legitimate, and that recreational sex should inspire shame and guilt, most notably, but not exclusively, the Catholic Church, which requires a celibate priesthood infamous for sexual predation. Clearly, denial and suppression don't work. Other religions see sex as a sacred act sanctioned by scripture. Until the English dominated India in the 17th century, Indian culture saw sex as one of the most common symbols of the bliss of union of the soul and God. It assumed mythic status and functioned as a metaphor for the creation and enlightenment. But things changed. In the succeeding centuries, India became a highly repressed society due to the influence of its Victorian rulers. The Victorians were hardly role models of enlightened sexuality because men and women could not communicate openly about their sexual needs. Prostitution flourished. Money could buy an orphan to do with what you pleased. Ah, money could buy an orphan to do with what you pleased. A prudish, abstemious attitude to sex denies this natural tendency, distorting it into something ugly and fearful. When procreation is valued and pleasure devalued, taboos and negative attitudes inevitably develop. Turning a natural tendency into an enemy is not wise. What you resist persists. What you resist persists. But religious restrictions are understandable up to a point, as we need an external moral force to guide us if we have no suitable inner compass. If unrestrained libido, however, leads to a spiritual and psychological downfall, please offer a solution. Freud's rudimentary foray into the field was long on analysis and short on remedies, as are anthropologist theories on the sexual mores of our ancestors, along with those who claim monogamy as the source of our sexual problems. Advances in technology have not helped us either. It seems that as we get technologically smarter, we get dumber about relationships, particularly the sexual relationships. The symbol of America's culture of sexual harassment, Harvey Weinstein, emerging from sex rehab, a changed man, is laughable. Let's not forget that women worldwide are still horrifically demonized and dehumanized. In certain Islamic countries, men who kill their sisters for sex out of wedlock and fathers who rape their daughters rarely suffer incarceration, much less warm, fuzzy sessions with caring therapists eager to delve into their dysfunctional childhoods. Is your childhood dysfunctional if the whole society is dysfunctional? In this age of pornography, which definitely suggests a lack of communication between the sexes, a misogynistic social group called the incels, involuntary celibates, have set up shop in a dark, hate-filled corner of the internet called the manosphere to promote a government-sanctioned right to sex, which amounts to nothing more than legal abuse of women. It seems love has very little to do with it, as far as they want the right to copulate with sex objects that they hate. Sex and media. Do I measure up? Sex sells. The marketing world capitalizes handsomely on it. Fair enough, but the media's tremendous creative and artistic force, which links our desire for stuff with the desire for security and pleasure, propagates sexual ideas and attitudes that thoroughly indoctrinate the public. Is it really to society's benefit that 60% of R-rated movies and nearly half of X-rated movies associate sex with violence? Sex becomes pornographic when it is divorced from love and affection, which are natural human emotions. The ins and outs, so to speak, of sexuality are romanticized and glorified in movies, how-to books, fashion magazines, and elsewhere. And why is that so bad? Because these images imply that we are failures if our sex lives do not measure up to media's ridiculous sexual ideas. Well, where else do horny 18-year-olds, amped up on testosterone and alcohol, get the idea that violent vertical sex in elevators and public restrooms is cool? Hmm. Marriage and sexual rights. If marriage is a contract based solely on a mutual desire to procreate, then sex is a necessary obligation, which individuals are free to view in whatever way they wish. But if you marry for love or pleasure, the idea that you have an enforceable right to sex is certainly a recipe for disaster. If a sexual partner unwillingly complies with your demand, un- if a sexual partner unwillingly complies with your demand, how happy will either of you be? If you do not pay attention to your spouse, but only turn to them to release pent-up energy, you shouldn't expect interesting, fulfilling sex. If you invest all your attention on your children or job, don't be surprised if your man's attention wanders. Good sex is not physical coupling alone. It requires attentive intimacy, which should start in the morning when you wake up and look at each other. It is a field of energy created with loving attention throughout the day, born of mutual appreciation and a willingness to hear and value what each other has to say. Don't take your partner for granted. Good sex doesn't prove anything except itself. At most, it occupies a tiny fraction of your waking hours. How you perform in other critical areas of life is equally, if not more, important. Tolerance and dispassion. Duality being what it is, passion's downside equals its upside. The downside is bondage to sex objects, and the corrective upside is dispassion, a foreign term in the world of sexuality. Dispassion, however, need not imply an absence of passion, only knowledge of the global factors involved in sexual situations and making wise decisions based on them. Because sex involves two people with different conditioning, dispassion is an acute appreciation of differences. When you are focused on getting rid of pain of your desire, you have little interest in the big picture. But the little picture, your momentary needs, is controlled by the situation. Getting what you want only works with the blessing of all the factors in the field. Even one small thought can instantly turn pleasure into pain. Differences are here to stay. An acute and generous appreciation of your differences is essential because differences produce mismatched sexual needs. What if the in and out is merely a mechanical lust reducer, like a workout at the gym for you, but your wife needs an emotional connection? Sex can be a way to facilitate sleep, mend fences, or affirm a relationship. It may be a hypercharged erotic scenario or a simple pleasure, like a good meal, a way to celebrate a victory or to soothe a defeat. Sometimes sex is earth shaking and sometimes it falls flat. But if you feel accepted and loved by your mate, sex is good no matter what. Sometimes you need a hug and sometimes you need an orgasm. When you're in a conscious, intimate sexual partnership, free of coercion and punishment, you are confident that your sexual feelings and needs can be met. Only when the mind is relaxed can love flow. Mood management. Apart from macrocosmic factors and immediate environmental conditions, the time of day, the presence of others in your house, unpredictable events affecting friends and family, etc., it is virtually impossible to enjoy sex without an appreciation of how your respective states of mind interact. It is a shame that sex isn't purely biological as it is for animals. If it were, then successful sex would only entail coordinating two biorhythms. Animals don't have a lot of subtle thoughts that need to be connected, so they are not neurotic about sex. They fall into heat simultaneously, and the rest takes place without a lot of fanfare. Although, if you have ever observed a herd of elk in rut, you would certainly be entertained by all the fuss that goes on. Even then, animals don't suffer low self esteem if they fail to copulate successfully. They just keep trying until they do. Beautiful sex is a meeting of minds and emotions, thoughts and feelings. If your mind is extremely tired and your partner's mind is equally agitated by his or her fears or desires, a connection is not likely, and sex becomes a boring, embarrassing routine, best quickly forgotten. Mismatched sexual needs. It's hard to argue that men's and women's sex drives don't vary greatly. Evolutionary psychologists attribute the difference to the survival of the fittest, the idea being that men are programmed to sow their seed to underwrite the future of the race, and women to protect their precious egg until they find a man willing to provide security. Although survival is no longer a pressing issue, men's sex drives tend to be more intense than women's. Men are more inclined to view sex as scratching an itch. It's hard to argue with the cliché that men give love to receive sex and women give sex to receive love. And it is generally the rule that women are more likely to lose interest in sex once their need to reproduce has been fulfilled. Because men's desire persists once they have offspring, infidelity need not necessarily be explained by sexual boredom, but by the unavailability of interested female peers. Apart from the more obvious impact that unresolved psychological issues and expectations have Apart from the more obvious impact that unresolved psychological issues and expectations have on sexual activity, sex counselors inform us that mismatched sex drives are one of the main causes of complaint for many couples. A complicated dance. Our natural sexual urges are determined by the three energies mentioned previously. These basic subconscious forces motivate every human being and change our states of mind from moment to moment with reference to the macrocosmic mind and our own life streams, our karma. Rajas, the energy of desire, is a dynamic, passionate, exciting energy suitable for accomplishing things. Tamas is a dull, heavy, slothful, sleepy energy that happens after prolonged exertion, sex for instance. And sattva is a clear, still, peaceful energy, suitable for sustained reflection and knowledge. If you are in a randy, excited state, and your partner is in a meditative or deeply exhausted state, don't expect good sex. Additionally, all three energies are operating in some permutation in both parties, so the probability of synchronizing the dominant energy and their companion energies appropriate for hot sex, for instance, is not very high. Furthermore, all three are constantly shifting from positive to negative polarities without permission. If you are both in the throes of passion, and your partner suddenly remembers that she left her purse on the dashboard and the keys in the car because she was in such a hurry to hop in the sack, or is worried about the children waking up, how likely will her mind remain concentrated and in tune with yours long enough to attain the orgasm of a century? Free will. Free will. Unlike animals, we have free will, which creates doubts and insecurities. Animals don't suffer. They cannot deviate from their sexual natures because they are unthinking programs created by nature, whereas we can deviate if we wish, but our programming dictates a more complicated set of rules. Animals are programmed to keep their species going and do not evaluate what happens to them, so they do not suffer moral uncertainties. It seems that we are not solely intended to replicate ourselves, although we are doing a good job. Yeah. So 3, situational ethics. Abstract universal values have no meaning apart from real-life situations. And the situations in which we find ourselves will not benefit us unless we provide the response that conforms to the situation itself, not what we want it to be, to our innate nature, not what we think we are, and to universal values. If you consider these 3 factors when you act, you may not get what you want from the situation, but you will get something much more valuable, the satisfaction that you have properly done everything that needed to be done according to your understanding at the time. Acting in this manner produces confident self-love and good sex lives, which redounds to your benefit in every way. In reality, sex is just sex. Good and bad are projections about whether a sexual encounter conforms to your expectations. So good sex is not an orgasm, an intense orgasm, simultaneous mutual orgasms of any sort. It has nothing to do with youth, stamina, physical appearance, the size of your penis, or the tightness of your vagina. It's about paying attention to your partner and acting in accordance with the rules of life as they apply in the bedroom. It is fidelity to the implicit and explicit sexual contract that has been established by both parties, and truthfulness with reference to your feelings about sex and your sex partner. It is a service-oriented attitude, putting the needs in and out of the bedroom of your significant other before your own, and gladly accepting whatever result comes. It is an activity that should contribute to your overall well-being and your partner's well-being. But conforming to the rules is not enough, as far as gaining pleasure from the body requires considerable mental discipline. If you are unable to keep your attention on the sexual feeling and enhance it by constant meditation, your mind will wander to other thoughts and the contact with the feeling will be broken. At the same time, see that your partner does not get lost in his or her feelings and fails to respond appropriately to your desires. 2 lustful people have a leg up, so to speak, on less committed sensualists because the lust itself concentrates the mind and keeps it on topic. Unfortunately, lust has a glaring downside. It makes you stupid. It so focuses your mind on the tiny, unprepossessing fraction of your anatomy between your legs that it eliminates the big picture altogether. So it screws the rules onward and upward to your goal, no matter how extensive the collateral damage. Chapter on sex. It's a long chapter. 4. Conforming to the conforming to the relationship contract. Intimate relationships often fail because implicit understandings are not established explicitly at the outset, Unacknowledged implicit contracts creates a fertile field for arguments, which often lead to permanent hostilities. If your sexual values differ greatly from your partner's, you're asking for trouble, no doubt about it. For instance, some men prefer anal sex and most women don't. In the beginning of the relationship, when the woman's attachment to the relationship is tentative, the man may honor her dislike, which he sensed from the beginning, but which was never discussed. Perhaps because he's tired of playing the dating game and wants to lock down a convenient and willing sex partner. He controls his short-term preference in favor of his long-term goal. At first, he is her charming knight in shining armor, pandering to her most gratuitous tendencies outside the bedroom. But once he feels his love object is tied down with children, etc., and his sexual interest in her starts to wane, as it does, he may feel that various kinky practices would spice up his sex life, even though his love object is quite happy with things as they are. So he starts lobbying for anal sex, or multiple partners, for instance, subtly at first with references to swinging, and other keywords that indicate his desire to change the unwritten rule. If his partner ignores his suggestions and resists, he can either let go of his preference or channel excess sexual energy into more lofty pursuits, which is unlikely. Or he can reinforce his desire to get what he wants, which may require that he play the power card and attempts to coerce her to bend to his will. Can he be blamed? Is she blameless? Yes and no in both cases. He can't be blamed because lust is not something you can control. You don't sit down and think, everything is pretty good. I think I'll feel very lustful today. Lust springs from the subconscious mind and torments the conscious mind without permission. He can't be blamed for trying as long as he is polite, friendly, and willing to accept her position. But he can be blamed for using power to coerce compliance and for not sitting down at the beginning and negotiating a sexual prenuptial agreement in good faith. She can't be blamed for sticking to her nature. She has legitimate reasons for her dislike. Perhaps her idea of sex does not include exposing herself to considerable discomfort. But she can be blamed for not making her boundaries completely clear in the beginning and indicating the consequences that an invasion of the sort he is suggesting would produce. Courtship, among other things, protects a woman's sense of virtue. Courtship, among other things, protects a woman's sense of virtue. Women are the primary custodians of society's moral values, even if they forego marriage for a career. But women are not above violating the rules of love, far from it. As much as men, they too become bored with same partner sex and conventional sex, and often seek excitement with multiple partners, kinky sex, pornography, or sadomasochism, for instance. Or women lose interest in sex once their biological clock has stopped ticking. Men are generally too busy turning the wheels of commerce and industry to give moral values sufficient attention. Not that men are necessarily predisposed to violate the rules, although many do. Contracts are intended to make transactions explicit so that implicit understanding don't run relationships aground. What is good sex? Good sex, however you define it, should not be a relationship requirement in the first place. as far as 98% of any relationship happens outside the bedroom. Sex should be only one of many factors used to evaluate a relationship. For instance, if the man doesn't help around the house and leaves child rearing and routine tasks to the woman, how likely is she going to feel sexy at the end of her long day? Honest communication determines our ability to navigate challenging situations. The be all and end all. All things being equal, however, an appreciation of the limited nature of sex induced happiness should keep your sex life on track. If you've been seduced by the notion that sex is the highest high, heaven help you. If sex is your God and fucking is your religion, you need a lot of help. You may imagine that you are a high performance sport genius, but you are merely surviving on a diet of Twinkies, white bread and jam, locked inside a prison of your own making. Intense prurient interest is off putting, tawdry, and unbecoming past the age of 21. If it is the be all and end all when you are 30, you are an empty, soulless person. If at 60 your silicone enhanced anatomy is attired in the fuck me costume of a high school cheerleader, you are a charter member of a dating site, then you are a pathetic shell of a person. Everything that goes up eventually falls down, sometimes sooner than later. Gravity has your number. Growing up is facing the facts of life, not gaming them. Obsession with anything apart from love, truth, and freedom is not in your best interests. If you put a bag over your head or a noose around your neck to restrict the flow of oxygen to your brain, to arouse yourself, and die in the process, your death is well deserved. Mm. Conformity to three basic sets of rules is required for deeply meaningful relationships, sexual or otherwise. And these three are non injury, karma yoga, and my special program. First, number one, non injury. A universal expectation of non injury in thought, word, and deed are built into every human being. Apart from physical harm or abuse, non injury includes values for truth, justice, freedom, respect, and compassion, which apply in the bedroom as they do elsewhere. The guiding moral principle is not complicated. Treat others as you would like to be treated. 2. Karma Yoga. Many issues can destroy relationships, but conflict about sex is undoubtedly near the top of the list. We should probably reduce the ideas of sex to the pleasure principle, and for the sake of simplicity, reduce pleasure to its most intense form, orgasm, since it is an experience apparently loved by everyone. Karma Yoga, one of the main teaching practices in Vedanta, is explained in much more detail in forthcoming chapters, but I mention it here because it takes the stress out of our sex lives. Sex involves a conducive environment and very intricate coordinated process of thoughts, actions, and emotions. If it is successful, it produces the mother of all pleasures and quickly becomes a binding ritual, which does not bode well for long-term peace of mind. Karma Yoga reduces performance anxiety, which invariably compromises the result, because orgasm, the goal, is uncertain. You do not know if you or your partner will reach orgasm together, separately, or whether it will live up to your expectations, which seem to grow with every successful encounter. It may be disappointing, mild, wildly mind blowing, or somewhere in between. Karma yoga is the common sense knowledge that the results of any action are out of your hands, even if you and your partner fancy yourself to be great lovers. If the result is out of your hands, assuming you do your best to communicate honestly, you can let go of the anxiety for the moment when the world stops and enjoy the process itself. 3. My special program. Nature has it easy as far as animals are concerned. Variations from duck to duck are minuscule. They all look alike, quack alike, and enjoy a few rudimentary skill sets. Yes, there is a basic human program, but vast differences exist within our species owing to free will. The complexity of human civilization requires a large variety of skill sets: thinkers, entertainers, entrepreneurs, managers, worker bees, artists, healers, organizers, investigators, criminals, lawyers, politicians, visionaries, priests, and what not else. An accountant and an artist or an athlete and scholar may successfully hook up solely on the basis of a momentary burst of lust, but a long-term meaningful relationship is less likely as far as their basic value structures are so different. The more differences involved, the less likely is compatibility and success in any endeavor. If you don't utilize your God-given talents, or if you try to create your own idea of who you are as a person by deviating from your inborn nature, particularly your sexual program, you won't be happy. Obviously, gender issues play a significant role. If a gender confused individual attempts sex with a gender unconfused person, successful sex is unlikely. If two gender confused individuals have a go at it, a successful outcome is also unlikely. Two confident same gender or heterosexual individuals are not again guaranteed good sex either, since environmental factors, states of mind, and global intensity of desires are also at play. Nobody knows why, but these are roughly three categories of people with regards. Ah, Nobody knows why, but there are roughly three categories of people with regards to sexual programs or needs. On one end of the spectrum are asexual people who are mostly uninterested in sex throughout their lives. There's nothing wrong with them, although they are often made to believe there is. They were just not blessed, or cursed as the case may be, with much libido. In the middle are those with normal sex drives, which they manage well or not so well, and normal was in quotation marks, which they manage well or not so well. Sex does not rule their lives, although it often causes much unhappiness. At the other end of the spectrum are sex addicts, obsessives, who remain fanatically fixated on sex well into their sunset years, nymphomaniacs, and satiromaniacs, for instance. Good sex is sex with the thought that represents your higher value. I am a whole and complete being whose nature is love. I love and respect myself, and I'm free to give myself totally in the moment to this temporary pleasure that reflects but a small fraction of my glory. So, what is bad sex? Bad sex is sex that obscures your spiritual self and motivates you to violate life's moral laws, causing injury to yourself and others. For instance, you may sneak off with your secretary for hot sex in the office toilet, but you can't call it good sex because it added to a burgeoning store of guilt, given that your wife is entitled to your love, such as it is. Sex without love and a dispassionate understanding of the spiritual meaning of life that pushes you into random, tawdry, self insulting relationships with strangers, prostitutes, and other unsavory sorts is a forceful denial of everything that is true and beautiful. It is the nail in the coffin of your self esteem, a downward spiral to spiritual ruin, a gray area. The moral appropriateness of certain sexual attitudes and activities sometimes depends on the cultural context, not on absolute values or personal preferences. Open relationships and infidelity. If you're spiritually inclined, a relationship with a swinger or a polyamorous person should be avoided at all costs, as it will cause moral conflict. If you are in a relationship with a sexually greedy person, you will have fidelity issues sooner or later. Such relationships are anything but free because they create subconscious conflicts which impede spiritual growth. Homosexuality. Homosexuality is taboo in most spiritual and religious traditions because religious people tend to believe that sex is intended for procreation, not pleasure. Flesh, however, is indifferent to gender, so homosexuality is not a sexual or a moral issue. People of various sexual persuasions shake hands with each other every day. Homosexuality falls under the category of personal programming and only becomes an issue situationally. In terms of relationships, the same rules apply to heterosexuals and homosexuals, all things being equal. Unfortunately for homosexuals, the playing field is not skewed in their favor, which means that they must be willing to suffer in direct proportion to their attachment to their idea of themselves and prevailing social views. Is homosexuality a biological or an identity issue? A homosexual living in a society of homosexuals would not need to identify himself as such because homosexuality is the default. Most heterosexuals don't think of themselves as such until they are confronted with the idea of homosexuality. My husband, who grew up in a rural small town, didn't know that homosexuals existed or that he was heterosexual until he was 19 when a man propositioned him. Since nobody knows what you think, and the lights are usually off when you are in bed, your sexual preference only becomes an issue when you expose others to it. It is an identity meant to define one type of behavior in terms of another type, not a biological imperative. From a spiritual perspective, the issue is only about your relationship to your identity. Are you comfortable with the way you see yourself? If not, your mind will be agitated and the quality of your life will suffer. There is no evidence of a correlation between specific sexual behaviors and happiness. There's plenty of evidence that happiness is directly related to your idea of yourself and how it positions you with reference to others. Failure to examine my identity carefully impacts every relationship I enjoy, particularly intimate relationships. Prostitution. Prostitution is not the oldest profession because it doesn't serve a useful purpose. Someone once called it the sacrifice on the altar of monogamy. However, it is usually, but not necessarily, guilt-inducing. If there's no connection between sex and love in your mind, and you're not interested in masturbation, hookup sex, marriage, or a meaningful relationship, then or a meaningful relationship, and you view sex as little more than scratching an itch, then indulge this sad option as you wish. But if you pay fair value and treat the sex object with respect, you will likely only harm your self-respect. Pornography. Pornography is almost socially acceptable these days and a good indicator of societal dysfunction. While you may think that porn enhances your sexuality, it is a fundamentally dishonest way to get pleasure for those who are too lazy, incompetent, and messed up to develop healthy relationships. At worst, it is a dark, desperate, dehumanizing world of degrading fantasies. Mind, the primary sex organ. Someone once joked that masturbation is sex with someone I care deeply about. Onanism is an efficient way to quickly develop a binding attachment to pleasure because you know best what works for you and can deliver the required actions efficiently. Sex takes place in the mind, whether another body is involved or not. And the mind, the gateway to the pleasure center, without love, is basically masturbation. Fantasy. Fantasy is a strange human phenomenon, an admission that reality is not good enough. Porn is obviously pure fantasy. If you need a fantasy to arouse yourself when you are in bed with someone, what's the point? As far as your primary sex organ, your mind, is not involved with your partner. It not only calls into question your sincerity, but reveals a deep-seated fear of intimacy and a lost opportunity to pleasure your lover's primary sex organ, assuming he or she is not fantasizing too. Spiritual sex. Sexual Tantra is an ancient Indian agglomeration of rituals and practices that incorrectly associate sex with spiritual enlightenment, a blissful state of non-duality. Today, it is associated almost exclusively with the idea that a practitioner can copulate his or her way to God. It is not a legitimate path to enlightenment because it creates a binding attachment to sex, which is not conducive to happiness, although tantric teachers claim otherwise. It appeals to hedonistic individuals who require a spiritual reason for indulging lust, which is generally considered a deadly sin. So here we go. The solution. The solution to all this. Mind management. From a spiritual perspective, managing any desire is related to the degree of agitation it causes, not the desire itself. In that desire is simply our God-given life force. How we relate to it determines our path in life. Mind or guna management is crucial to managing desire because the mind is nothing more than one's priorities and values. This topic is covered in detail in chapter 11, which unfolds the way the mind works, the types of thoughts that run it, and the three energies, rajas, tamas, and sattva, motivating all thoughts and feelings. So, how do I manage the sex drive? Is celibacy a solution? Celibacy is easy or difficult, depending on the intensity of biological factors beyond one's control. Trying to efface an intense sex drive by acts of will, complicated ascetic practices, for instance, is virtually impossible and causes physical and spiritual troubles, whereas a weak sex drive can be removed by consistently disidentifying with the feeling of lack and taking refuge in your whole and complete spiritual self. A moderate sex drive can be occasionally indulged without harm and or sublimated into spiritual practices like meditation or self-inquiry. Sublimation is no walk in the park if the sexual urge is powerful, but over time and with dedicated, consistent and disciplined practice, it is possible to transform the sexual craving into a positive spiritual force. Consistent spiritual practice eventually affects biological energies, gradually reducing cravings. Sublimation renders the sex drive non-binding. A non-binding desire is a preference that does not disturb the mind. It can be as easily renounced as indulged. We constantly let go of things we no longer value. Ask yourself, do I desire freedom from bondage to my desires more than the momentary satisfaction they provide? We spend about 98% of our lives in non-sexual activities. So if your mind is occupied with sex thoughts more than 2% of the time, you will benefit by renouncing them in favor of more elevating thoughts. Karma yoga is sublimation. Secular karma yoga is simply practical knowledge concerning the results of actions, divorced from the idea of preparing the mind for liberation. Sorry, I'm going to read it again. Secular karma yoga is simply practical knowledge concerning the results of actions, divorced from the idea of preparing the mind for liberation. It can be applied to sex. It is surrendering your actions to the field, which removes performance anxiety. Performance anxiety is a problematic component of human sexuality. Successful sex is anxiety-free sex and may lead to love. When you're totally present with your partner, not living in your fantasies, love can flower. Loving sex in the Karma Yoga spirit is giving and receiving pleasure in a sacred and supremely satisfying way. When love and gratitude are added to its secular variant in the context of a desire for liberation, you have sacred Karma Yoga. You consecrate the sexual encounter to God at the outset, which removes anxiety, and you gladly accept the results. Over time, it removes sexual cravings which disturb the mind. But sacred karma yoga is a formal discipline that prescribes certain rituals for those engaged in self-inquiry, of which sex is not one. Don't imagine that sex is a valid spiritual path, because the purpose of sex is pleasure, not liberation. Pleasure never lasts, but liberation does, because it is your eternal nature. Yes, sex may be an important part of your life, but it should be no more important than any other basic need, like food, for instance. You don't eat to get enlightened. Sublimation and self-inquiry. The last heading. Sublimation and self-inquiry. Inquiry is replacing the idea I must satiate this urge with the thought I am whole and complete, and sticking with the thought until the urge is rendered non-binding or disappears altogether. If you cannot stand up to your desire, you are a weakling. Desire seen from the perspective of the self is not a problem. Only irresistible desires that cause us to violate our highest values are. If the thought of your completeness does not neutralize the desire, you need to think the desire through. Desire blinds us to the fact that all we ever want when we want an object is a connection with ourself. It is knowing that joy only resides in the self and that activities are inert ideas devoid of self-nature. It is appreciating the fact that the joy appearing in objects is just a transient joy, a pale reflection of the bliss of your immortal nature. So that's the end of chapter 8 on sex and duality. It was sex and duality. The next chapter is stages of seeking love. And I'll carry on with that tomorrow. So have a great day. Bye.